And by the way, just a further clarification, as I was getting lectured in the Facebook comment section as to what the law reads and what's irrelevant, I'm aware of what the law reads. And that my point was not what the law is. I understand what, I don't actually, maybe nobody understands what the law is because there's no real precedent in a case like this. My point was simply and clearly about the disenfranchisement of the voters if you put a Democrat in that seat when one didn't even bother to run in the election.
And I agree with you.
Yes. And I hope the legislators fix this time.
Oh, Lord, yes.
You know, that's the thing. Every time you think there's a law that covers something, another mess breaks out, and there's a law that doesn't cover it.
You know, Rob, I smile or laugh occasionally when people say, well, it was 100-page document or 1,000-page document or 1,500-page document. Nobody ever reads it. The reason it's these thick documents is they try to cover all the eventualities. When you have something that's only 1 or 2 or 3 pages, it leaves it open for abuse, and someone's going to find a loophole to work around it.
That's true.
I think you just end it with, in the event of a scenario that has not arisen, contact Stubblefield B.
The B stands for Bonnie.
Way to escape that one. Our guest in this segment is John Everson from Ameriprise Financial and the Mirius Group of Financial Advisors on Winchester Avenue in Martinsburg. John, good morning. How are you, sir?
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm great, but I got to acknowledge I listened to some of that last segment. I'm just grateful that I work in an industry that is predictable, that is reliable, where you don't have all the uncertainties that you have in politics. That's all I can tell.
That is so true. That is so true.
And it's been said we don't have anything else to say after that, John.
Yeah, exactly.
John Everson. John, one of the things that drives me nuts in your world, and I'll give it to Phil on this one all the time when we talk before he goes on at 6:38 in the morning, is you can have a company, let's take Apple, for instance, and they have this earnings report that it beats expectations. It looks like it's blown out the quarter, and the stock drops because it didn't beat it by enough. So it wasn't enough that they made $1 gajillion billion this quarter. They were supposed to make 10 gajillion billion, even though the expectations were they were only supposed to make a couple $1 billion. And then you got a company that still it's not even profitable yet, but it sold enough that it lost less money than we thought they were going to lose, and their stock goes through the roof.
So, Rob, you're telling me that doesn't make sense to you?
No, that doesn't make sense to me at all.
Come on.
And that's your world, man.
I don't know why you don't understand that.
Yeah.
But it is predictable, right?
It is very predictable. Think about this. Most people in the financial services industry, I guess I've been very fortunate. I probably am that proverbial duck where the water rolls off of its back, okay? Because if you internalize most of the stuff that goes on in this industry, like Rob was just talking about, you would be probably unfit to be in the industry because there's so many things that at times leave you just kind of scratching your head with, okay, that doesn't make sense, but let's go with it. And what's the next best decision we can make now with the facts that we now have?
That sounds like a very calm, rational way.
Quite logical.
Of dealing with this inexplicable stock movement.
As you were saying that, John, I was thinking about what we're seeing in sports now, specifically basketball, and I enjoy college basketball. There's an argument that do you go the analytics, i.e. statistics, or do you go your gut reaction? As a financial advisor, what do you fall back on? Is it your gut or is it analytics?
Yes.
Oh, you cut
John
out.
Everson. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Hey, sorry about that. You guys still there?
Yes. Yeah, you frizzled.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I missed the very tail end of the question, but I think I heard enough of it, Mr. Stubblefield, to grab the question.
John, the rest of us doze off in the middle of his questions, too. Don't worry about
it. And that's a guy that would not come by and pick me up this morning.
Two guys who wouldn't come by and pick you up.
In stereo.
Yeah. Well, the answer that I'm going to give you is that oftentimes we do a combination of all of those sorts of things. In other words, where you do have to look at numbers and data that you have to make a decision with, number one. Number two, there is a certain element of gut instinct and that you do have to go with. Now, one of the things that we always stress to people, and in fact, I've got some data that I'll share with you here in a little bit that reinforces what I'm about to say. One of the things we always tell people is you have to try to wring out the emotion. And I'm not saying R-I-N-G. I'm saying W-R-I-N-G. You have to wring out the emotion that often comes into a financial decision-making process, okay? And the point that I make is that when people make emotionally driven financial decisions, almost always they're going to do the opposite of what they probably should have done in the first place.
You're sounding like Davey Martinez.
There you go, exactly. Well, hey, and I've always been a really good at standing in the middle of the road, one foot on both sides of the double yellow line, and taking that neutral position, because this is one of those where you can't again get overly excited about things that take place. A good example: just about a week ago, we got an email from a client who was concerned that financial markets, tail end of 2024 had, late December we had tailed off, and equities coming out of the starting gate in 2025 were not off to a positive start. And the question was, what's causing that? Well, I don't know that anything really is causing that, other than on a day-to-day basis, you get these pundits and these analysts and these journalists who are looking for some kind of cause and effect. And so they assign, whether it's, some kind of a cause to what is taking place. So whether it's a good earnings report, like Rob was referencing, or, a bad unemployment number, or consumer confidence, or whatever it might happen to be, you have to be really careful about reading too much into those kinds of things. That's why I said I like my industry, which is very predictable, because, you think about it, it's one of those where, you have to take all of the noise that is swirling around, and you truly do have to filter out a lot of that and just come back to what is, someone's primary goal, what's their objective, what's the time horizon, what kind of an allocation and mix makes sense for them, and wring that emotion out of that decision-making process and help people stay focused on what's really important.
John Everson, this is John Doyle. Are there types of situations where you might lean one way or the other? A type of situation where you might lean more toward logic and less toward feeling, or other types of situations where you're thinking, here's where feeling might come in more?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there are. Hey, let me ask you, Mr. Doyle. Did you have a brother who was a professor down at Shepherd College University years ago?
Well, I still have him.
Okay.
And he's playing golf now.
So I got to acknowledge it's because of, and he taught some computer science classes,
yes,
correct?
Yeah, and business statistics and stuff like that.
And it's because of that I am not in the technology industry today. I will readily admit I was not his best student, because, but at least I was smart enough to pay attention and to realize that industry is probably not right for me. So let me go back to your original question. And yes, there are times where you do have to look at what's going on. I'll give you a classic example. Of course, because I'm rolling up on here in about another 60 days. I'm rolling up on the end of my 39th year in this business. So I start year 40 in late March. And what's interesting about this is my career has seen the second and third worst performances ever in history for equities. I have seen and experienced the steepest drop ever in history for equities. Not the deepest drop, but the steepest drop. So I want to answer your question by going back just about 5 years ago, almost to this time, February 13th of 2020 through late March 2020, about a 5.5-week window of time where when you went back and you looked at it, the S&P 500 dropped better than 30% in a 5.5-week window of time. Now, of course, that was when the COVID pandemic was exploding onto the scene, and we're canceling, basketball tournaments and all kinds of telling people don't go anywhere and pay attention to the arrows on the floor in the supermarket when you go buy your groceries. Only go in one direction, and it was an emotion-filled time. A lot of emotional stuff going on. And what was interesting about that was one where if you looked at that in its at its rawest form, clearly you would have to interpret, okay, people are being told, don't go anywhere, don't do anything, don't consume stuff. And that's the reason why, lumber production slowed down and, all of these other variables. Well, the next thing you know, people were sitting at home and they're like, well, let me go, let's remodel or let's start these projects, or they were coming up with things to do, which is why then you had all these supply issues. The point that I make is this. There was a time where if you looked at that event and what the performance of the S&P 500 was doing, that would cause a person to say, yeah, maybe, everything is going down. Maybe we should get out. When in fact, common sense and logic said, you know what? This is probably a fairly temporary thing. The really smart people are probably going to control their emotion, and they're going to use this as an opportunity to purchase at deep discounts. Those who did, and we did have many, many clients who actually did that, have the past 5 years they've been rewarded for having made an unemotional decision at that point in time.
Got it.
Yeah. John, something you mentioned a while ago that made me think there was a point I was not aware of. And it's my sense that our political world has been taken over by social media. Is the same thing true with our financial world?
That's a great question as well. I'll tell you what our world has been taken over with is by the speed of information. Not so much necessarily the social media side of it, although that now has only taken the speed of information that's occurred over the last 20, 25 years, 30 years or so, and accelerated it yet that much more, okay? And so the point that I make is that, think about this. When I first got into this industry decades ago, in order to execute transactions, you had to have a license in order to do that, okay? And you had to call somebody in the mid-1980s in order to place a trade. Now, a lot of times they would at least talk to you about, is that something that's really appropriate for you to do? And there could be a little bit of some common sense perhaps brought to bear. When you then take information, you put it in everybody's pocket like we do today with these pocket computers that we call phones, and you've got everybody in America at any moment in time who can, click an app and see exactly minute by minute what's going on with financial markets, what the news around the world is, what's happening. And again, this is a point that we reinforce with folks all the time. There's too many people who have this cause and effect mentality. Well, that is taking place. Therefore, I should probably knee-jerk react and do something financially. Oftentimes, those are the wrong things to do. So, yeah, I do believe that not so much the social media side of it, although, again, I think it has accelerated the pace at which news does travel, but the fact that we've now empowered everybody through these, direct access accounts, everybody's 401k and so forth, you can be sitting, on a tow motor in a warehouse and executing transactions inside your 401k plan. While that has many benefits, there's also a lot of downside to that because, again, there are a lot of folks who don't wring that emotion out, and they make decisions sometimes that are self-sabotaging.
John Everson, our guest here on the program from Ameriprise Financial and the Mirius Group of Financial Advisors. John, it's 2025, and I know Congress a couple of years ago passed a few laws in regards to retirement, extending the ages when you could take RMDs, for instance, and treatment of Roth IRAs and what have you. Are there any changes for this year further along with that law?
Yeah, ultimately, again, another really good question because Those
Do you think mine was better than Bill's, though?
Absolutely not. Come on, John. Don't fall for that crap.
I think mine was better.
Don't fall.
Hey, remember, I'm a neutral guy. I'm going to measure them all equal. So
I'm going to take that as a yes.
So for 2025, there are not any new changes with regard to distribution ages. So required minimum distribution age does remain at the age of 73, okay? And the way that this works is that eventually moves up to the age of 75, such that if you are not the age of 73 by the year 2033, then your RMD age becomes the age of 75. So it's a little convoluted. Think about this, guys. When I first got into this business, I used to think that requirement of distributions actually started about 7 months after I had been in the industry. Okay, so I actually predate the mandatory force out of retirement accounts. And when that first happened, you had to be the age of 70 and 1/2 or older. Now, at the time, I'm thinking, who in the world thought counting by half birthdays was a good idea? Because I don't know if you've ever tried to do the math on that, but it's a little confusing about when does someone turn 70 and 1/2? Okay, I was born, for example, in the month of October. Well, my half birthday is going to be in late April. Okay, so you always had to kind of pause just a bit and think that through. And it existed that way for the first from the fall of 1986, from October of 1986, when the Tax Reform Act was signed into law. And that existed all the way up to Secure Act 1.0, which is then where these changes started to take place, where we then took it from 70 and a half, we pushed it back to 72, and then Secure Act 2.0 pushed it from 72 to 73, with a phase out then to the age of 75. And one of the things we always remind people of is, look, just because the government is not mandating that you take those dollars out, that deferral is not necessarily a good thing, okay? Because far too often we meet people who have deferred themselves into a future tax situation. A lot of people don't think of it like this, but those retirement accounts, whatever still is left in those retirement accounts at your passing, and it's going to, say, that next generation, your children, your grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whoever you're leaving the money to, those assets, the Internal Revenue Service refers to them as income in respect of a decedent assets, IRD assets, which translates to English to mean you didn't pay tax on the growth of those dollars, and then oftentimes you didn't pay tax on the deposit that went in there. Therefore, we still expect tax to be paid. And so the point that I make is, just because the government keeps pushing those distribution ages further out does not necessarily mean that deferring is the best idea, because far too often then what happens, people defer, they leave these large balances inside these retirement accounts. They've passed on distribution laws now for the IRD assets after death mandate that those accounts have to be cleaned out within a 10-year window of time. Contrast that to the way that it was originally, which was distributions had to be taken over the non-spousal beneficiaries' remaining life expectancy. So someone, say, who is 40 inheriting money from a parent would have had, a 35, almost a 40-year window of time to do distributions. That now has been shortened into a 10-year window of time. So there's a lot of income tax evolution that's taken place over the course of the last few years that people really have to be on their toes and pay close attention to the things that are taking place, which is why when you think about the politicians getting together, and the only thing they then sometimes do is make our job that much more interesting.
John, you mentioned the word politicians getting together. And
that's actually more than one word. Biblical.
That's right, yeah.
Well,
my question
I'm in one room at the same time.
Well, that's what I'm going to address. The budget deficit rose in December, and now it's 40% higher than it was a year ago. As the body of politicians, what would you think they're going to do to address this problem, which has to be addressed?
Yeah, it has to be addressed. You are.
Is that a good question, Rob?
Correct.
Is that a good question?
Yeah,
a better question than Rob's?
I think it's a fair. It's an average question. I wouldn't say that's a good question.
But it was a great statement, because it is an issue that has to be addressed. Think about this. There's none of us as individuals would be allowed to go to continue to pile up debt to the enormous levels that debt exists today, at which point in time creditors would say to us, we're not going to lend you more money for spending. Now, this is there's a whole host of it. I've been reading a lot of stuff. Obviously we're going through a presidential transition and change today with Inauguration Day, and there's a lot of hand wringing that Trump is talking about more tax cuts and so forth, and projecting things. Well, a lot of this really does come down to, it's not so much necessarily the tax cuts themselves, but it's more the what revenue are you generating combined with how are you spending money. And it is, as we've talked about before when I've been on here, it is the spending that just leaves you scratching your head at times, where dollars, sometimes tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of dollars get thrown around like it's pocket change, and it's not. It's indebtedness to many generations going forward, unless we eventually can get that spending under control, and that ultimately is what's going to have to occur.
Well, how will it occur? What's your prediction?
Well, yeah, great. Yeah, I don't know is the answer that I will give you. Other than. So I do know that there is. I'll give you a classic example, and I know I work in an area where there's a lot of federal government installations.
Got about a minute and a half, John. By the way, about a minute and a half.
I'll give you a classic example. I cannot tell you the number of times I've had people who work for the federal government will be talking about something that's related to their work, and they'll talk about, well, we've got to spend that money because it's in our budget before the end of the fiscal year, because if we don't spend it, we won't get it next year. Well, as John, the taxpayer, hears that, what he hears is, but wait a minute, we didn't have that money in the first place. Why are you spending money for things you may not necessarily need just because you had an allocation to spend it? And I think, whether or not this Department of Government Efficiency, can make headway or not, there's a lot of stuff I think we can do just to bring some common sense back to how government does spend money. I've often said people ought to spend at some point in their life being an entrepreneur, being responsible for how financial stuff gets allocated. They'd have a much different perspective on what money can do.
And you're absolutely right, John Everson. That's why maybe about 30 years ago, this guy named Peter Purr came up with the idea of what's called zero-based budgeting. It's been tried in a number of places. It doesn't seem to be very effective at solving the problem, but it was an excellent idea. At least it at least understood the problem.
John, how do people get in touch with you about the things we talked about today and financial planning?
Yep. Our office is located at 1270 Winchester Avenue here in Martinsburg. While it is a federal holiday today, some of us will be there today. Or you can reach us by phone at area code 304-263-4343. We're there Monday through Friday.
And John, I know you started off saying that John's question was a great question, which would have trumped the good questions that both Bill and I asked. I appreciate you editing yourself to not actually commit to that. Thank you.
There you go. Always happy to be neutral.
Give our best to Lisa, sir.
Yes, indeed. You guys have a good day.
You too.
You too.